On the rain-soaked night of February 24, 1991, 300,000 soldiers waited in the Saudi Arabian darkness for a war that would remake the world in 100 hours. Behind them lay 6 months of preparation. It's the largest military deployment since the Second World War. Ahead lay the fourth largest army on Earth, dug into sandberms. It's bristling with Soviet tanks, commanded by a dictator who had promised the mother of all battles. The soldiers checking their rifles in the pre-dawn blackness could not know they were about to participate in the most lopsided ground campaign in modern military history. They only knew that in minutes they would cross into a country called Iraq, and some of them would never cross back. The man who would send them forward sat in a command bunker beneath Riyadh, his bulk filling a leather chair, his eyes fixed on a wall of screens showing unit positions across 400 miles of desert. General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. had spent his career preparing for a war like this conventional clash of armies, steel against steel, where American technological superiority could finally prove itself after the humiliation of Vietnam. He had told his commanders the plan was simple. Simple, but not easy. They would convince Saddam Hussein that the main attack would come from the sea and from Kuwait. Then they would swing the most powerful armored force ever assembled around the Iraqi flank. Through empty desert, the Iraqis considered impassable, and destroy the Republican Guard from behind. The deception had worked. Iraqi divisions faced the Persian Gulf, expecting an amphibious assault that would never come. They faced the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, expecting a frontal attack through minefields and oil-filled trenches. They did not face west, where 2 entire corps, over 150,000 soldiers, crouched in the darkness like a coiled spring. At 4 a.m, local time, the spring released. The first soldiers across the border were not the tanks that would dominate the coming days, but the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, their Black Hawk helicopters racing north in the largest air assault operation in military history. Their objective was Highway 8, the main supply route connecting Baghdad to Kuwait. If they could cut it, they would sever the lifeline of every Iraqi soldier in the theater. 2,000 helicopters filled the sky that night, their rotors beating against the desert wind, carrying an entire division into enemy territory in a matter of hours. Lieutenant Colonel Tom Garrett commanded one of the lead battalions. In an oral history recorded years later and preserved in the Army Heritage and Education Center, he recalled the strange silence of the flight, how the noise-canceling headsets created an eerie calm even as tracer fire rose from below, how the soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark, each man alone with his thoughts. Each man wondering if the landing zone would be hot. It was not. The Iraqis had never imagined an assault from this direction. Through desert they believed no army could cross. The paratroopers touched down in empty sand, secured their positions, and waited for the thunder that was coming from the south. That thunder was the 7th Corps, the most powerful armored formation the United States had ever fielded. 5 heavy divisions, over 1,500 tanks, 250,000 soldiers. Their commander was Lieutenant General Frederick Franks Jr., a man who had lost part of his leg to a mine in Vietnam and now walked with a prosthetic. A man who understood what it meant to ask soldiers to advance into fire. He had argued for a slower, more methodical approach. The doctrine called it synchronization, hitting the enemy with overwhelming force at the decisive point rather than racing forward piecemeal. Schwarzkopf wanted speed. The tension between them would shape the 100 hours to come. But in those first moments, speed was everything. The lead elements of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, veterans of every American war since 1917, breached the Iraqi defensive lines in less than 2 hours. Engineers had trained for months to clear paths through minefields, to bridge the anti-tank ditches, to punch holes through the sandberms. They did it under fire, under smoke, under the constant fear that chemical weapons might descend at any moment. Saddam had used gas against his own people. No one doubted he would use it against the Americans. He never did. That decision, or perhaps that hesitation, would remain one of the war's enduring mysteries. The chemical suits stayed sealed in their bags. Atrapian injectors stayed unused. And the American advance accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. By noon on the first day, coalition forces had captured over 5,000 Iraqi prisoners. By nightfall, that number had tripled. The scenes repeated across the front. White flags emerging from bunkers, emaciated conscripts stumbling forward with hands raised, entire battalions surrendering to the first American vehicles they saw. These were not the elite Republican Guard. These were regular army soldiers, many of them Shia Muslims with no love for Saddam, all of them devastated by 6 weeks of air bombardment that had destroyed their supplies, their communications, their will to fight. Some had not eaten in days. Some kissed the hands of the soldiers who captured them. But the Republican Guard still waited in reserve 6 divisions of Saddam's best troops, equipped with the latest Soviet armor, positioned to counterattack once the main assault revealed itself. They were the prize Schwarzkopf wanted. Destroying them would not just win this war. It would prevent the next one. The man who would find them first was a 29-year-old captain named Herbert Raymond McMaster, commanding Eagle Troop of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. His mission was reconnaissance, to locate the enemy and report back, not to engage. But war rarely respects mission parameters. On the afternoon of February 26th, in a sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than a mile, McMaster's 9 tanks crested a low ridge and found themselves staring at an entire Iraqi armored brigade. The Tawakalna Division, one of the Guard's best, had dug into defensive positions along a map coordinate called 73 Easting. McMaster had seconds to decide. If he stopped to report, the Iraqis would engage him in a static fight his small force could not win. If he attacked, he would be charging straight into a prepared position with overwhelming numbers against him. He attacked. What followed was 23 minutes of mechanized violence that would become the most studied tank engagement since the Second World War. McMaster's gunner, Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, destroyed the first Iraqi tank at 1,400 meters, then the second, then the third. The M1A1 Abrams, with its thermal sights and stabilized gun, could acquire and kill targets in conditions where the Soviet-built T-72s were effectively blind. The Iraqis fired back, and their rounds bounced off American armor designed to withstand exactly this punishment. McMaster's tanks advanced through the enemy position, firing and moving, while the Iraqis died in their vehicles without ever clearly seeing what was killing them. In those 23 minutes, Eagle Troop destroyed over 80 Iraqi vehicles and killed or captured hundreds of soldiers. McMaster lost one man, a tragedy for that soldier's family, a miracle by any historical standard of armored warfare. The Battle of 73 Easting was not a battle, it was an execution. It proved what military theorists had predicted for years, that the gap between American technology and Soviet-era equipment was not a matter of degree, it was a matter of kind. The news filtered back to Baghdad, where Saddam Hussein faced the collapse of everything he had built. His army was not just losing, it was dissolving. His generals reported unit after unit destroyed, overrun, or surrendered. The Republican Guard, his insurance policy against coups, his instrument of terror, was being annihilated in the desert. He had promised the Arab world a victory against Western imperialism. He had received something closer to a massacre. But the killing was not one-sided. In the chaos of the 100 hours, American soldiers died too, some from enemy fire, some from accidents, some from the particular horror of modern warfare called friendly fire. On the night of February 26th, Air Force A-10 attack aircraft mistook a convoy of the 24th Infantry Division for an Iraqi column. The pilots, operating in poor visibility with incomplete information, made a decision in seconds that killed 2 American soldiers and wounded 6 others. The families who received those notifications would carry that grief forever. The pilots who pulled those triggers would carry something perhaps worse. And then there were the civilians. In Kuwait City, the retreating Iraqi army left behind devastation that defied comprehension: prisoners tortured and murdered, oil wells set ablaze, a nation's infrastructure systematically destroyed. Along the highway north from Kuwait City, fleeing Iraqi soldiers and the civilians trapped among them became targets for coalition aircraft in what would later be called the Highway of Death. The images burned vehicles stretching to the horizon, bodies scattered across the asphalt shocked the world and prompted urgent calls for a ceasefire. On February 28th, exactly 100 hours after the ground campaign began, President George Herbert Walker Bush announced a suspension of offensive operations. The decision was controversial then, and remains controversial now. The Republican Guard had been mauled, but not destroyed. Saddam remained in power. The victory, though decisive, was incomplete. In the weeks that followed, that incompleteness would have consequences no one anticipated. Encouraged by the American triumph, Shia Muslims in southern Iraq and Kurds in the north rose against Saddam's regime. They expected American support. They did not receive it. Schwarzkopf, in a ceasefire agreement he would later regret, permitted the Iraqis to fly helicopters ostensibly for logistics, actually for counterinsurgency. Those helicopters hunted the rebels with chemical weapons and machine guns. Thousands died in the marshes and mountains while American soldiers watched from the other side of newly drawn lines. For the soldiers who had fought those 100 hours, return home brought parades and gratitude, a nation eager to celebrate what felt like redemption after Vietnam. But some of them carried wounds that did not show the images that returned in dreams. The sounds that triggered panic years later, the questions about what they had done and what they had failed to do. Gulf War syndrome would become a medical and political controversy for decades. The psychological toll would prove harder to measure but no less real. What had changed was not just the map of the Middle East, but the nature of warfare itself. The Gulf War introduced the world to precision-guided munitions that could strike individual buildings, to stealth aircraft invisible to radar, to satellite navigation that allowed armies to cross featureless desert without ever losing their way. It demonstrated that information dominance, knowing where the enemy was when the enemy did not know where you were, could be as decisive as firepower. Future wars would be fought on these terms, by soldiers who had studied what happened in those 100 hours. The men who made the decisions that February are mostly gone now. Schwarzkopf died in 2020, Powell in 2021. The soldiers who were young then have gray in their hair. Grandchildren who ask about the medals in their closets. The tanks that seemed invincible have been replaced by drones and cyber weapons and technologies. That would have seemed like science fiction in 1991, but the desert remembers. In Kuwait, monuments mark the liberation. In Iraq, mass graves still yield their secrets. Along Highway 8, the asphalt has been repaved, but farmers still find fragments of military equipment in their fields. And somewhere in the archives, in the oral histories and after-action reports and personal letters, the voices of that 100-hour survived young men who crossed a line in the sand and found themselves, for better and worse, at the hinge of history. They did not know they were changing the world. They only knew they were trying to survive it. And in the end, that is what war always is. Collision of grand strategy and private terror. Of nations and individuals, of machines, and the fragile humans who operate them. The Gulf War lasted 100 hours. Its consequences are with us still.